Pelican Bay Supermax, California's most feared prison. The sound of silent. The steel door slams shut with a thunderous clank. The sound echoes for a moment and then dies, swallowed by a silence so heavy it feels alive. Inside a tiny, windowless cell, a man sits on a hard steel bunk, staring at walls that seem to push him closer with every second. His hands tremble as he presses his ear against the vent. At first there's nothing, just a faint hum of circulation. Then, so quiet he isn't sure it's real, he hears a whisper. He jerks back, scanning the room, but he's alone. Is it another inmate trying to pass a message through the air ducts, or is it just his mind, splitting under the pressure of being buried alive? This is Pelican Bay State Prison Security Housing Unit, known as the SHU, a place so feared that prisoners call it a box, a place designed to crush men without ever laying a hand on them. Some inmates last years, others lose themselves in days. And this is only the beginning. Because to truly understand how this fortress of silence became California's most feared prison, we need to go back to where it all started, the birth of a monster. Pelican Bay was born out of chaos. In the 1980s, California's prison system was exploding. Cells meant for one man held 2 or 3. Violence wasn't the exception, it was daily life. Rival gangs clashed on the yards. Fights turned into riots, and correctional officers were caught in the middle. Stabbings were so common that in some prisons guards carried shields just to walk through a cell block. The state needed an answer. Officials didn't want just another prison. They wanted something radical, a place that would take the worst of the worst and lock them away so tightly that they could never again influence life inside or outside the walls. So in 1989, on a fog-covered stretch of remote Northern California coast, near the Oregon border, Pelican Bay State Prison opened. It looked less like a correctional facility and more like a military installation. High concrete walls stretched into the mist. Guard towers bristled with floodlights and rifles. And deep inside sat the most infamous part of the prison, the Security Housing Unit. The SHU wasn't just a cell block. It was an experiment. Each prisoner lived in a concrete box about the size of a parking space. The doors weren't bars, but solid steel with only a narrow slot at the bottom where a food tray could slide through. There were no windows, no view of the outside world. Lights glowed faintly and never went dark. The air was stale, recycled again and again through vents. Inmates spent 23 hours a day in these cells. The 1 hour outside wasn't in an open yard with other men. It was in another concrete box, a barren pen nicknamed the Dog Run. No grass, no sky, just high gray walls and a slice of mesh above. The philosophy behind this was simple. Total isolation equals total control. Officials believed that if they cut leaders off from their soldiers, if they stripped away human contact, gangs would collapse. The SHU would sever the lifelines of communication, leaving the most dangerous inmates powerless. But human beings aren't built for silence. Within months of Pelican Bay opening, cracks began to show. Prisoners started breaking down. Some scratched their walls until their fingers bled. Others shouted nonsense for hours just to hear a sound in the void. Guards would pass by and see men pacing in endless circles, muttering to themselves. A few sat frozen, staring into space as if they'd already given up on existing. Psychologists who studied the prison called it SHU syndrome, a cocktail of paranoia, depression, and hallucinations brought on by sensory deprivation. One doctor famously said, "If you want to design a place to break someone without touching them, you would design the SHU." Stories of these conditions began spreading. Inmates transferred from other prisons described Pelican Bay as a ghost town of the living. Silent corridors, no voices, no laughter, only the slam of doors and the shuffle of chains. Families dreaded the day their loved ones were sent north, because they knew that men rarely came back the same. Even guards felt it. Some admitted the silence was oppressive, unnerving in ways they couldn't explain. But fear for them came from something else. Pelican Bay didn't just hold ordinary criminals. It held the masterminds, the generals of the prison world, the shot callers who commanded entire gangs across California. And here's where the plan began to fail. Instead of breaking those gangs, Pelican Bay gave them something else. uninterrupted time, privacy from the yard, and a fortress from which to strategize. The prison built to end chaos was slowly becoming its own kind of monster. And what happened next would change California's prison system forever. The Gang Command Center. Isolation was supposed to destroy the gangs. But instead, Pelican Bay gave them a new advantage. When leaders were sent to the SHU, they weren't distracted by fights in the yard or prison politics or daily chaos. They were left alone in their cells, nothing but time and a mind determined to keep control. And somehow, against all odds, they found ways to reach the outside world. Communication became an art form. A whisper through an air vent could pass a coded message cell to cell. A letter written in invisible ink, made from shampoo, coffee, or even the juice of an orange, could carry orders out of prison without a guard suspecting a thing. Chess games with hidden instructions inside each move became a secret language. Pelican Bay's SHU was meant to silence the gangs, but instead it became their headquarters. The Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, groups that had always fought bitter wars on the outside, were suddenly locked down with their generals sitting in neighboring cells. And from there, they ruled. Orders left Pelican Bay like ripples in water. A command whisper in the SHU on a Monday could spark a stabbing in Los Angeles by Friday. Drugs, weapons, and extortion rackets all flowed under their control. Even in the silence, the gangs thrived. One correctional officer later admitted, "We thought isolation would break them, but it gave them more control. It gave them a space to think. And thinking made them even more dangerous." The state was horrified, but there was little they could do. To move one gang leader was to risk placing him somewhere weaker, where he could cause even more chaos. To keep him in Pelican Bay meant allowing him to continue ruling like a ghost king. And then violence erupted anyway. Though the SHU kept inmates apart, Pelican Bay's general population still had yards. And those yards became blood-soaked battlegrounds whenever orders filtered down. A single coded message from the SHU could trigger a riot that would leave dozens injured. The prison staff knew it. The inmates knew it. And outside in California cities, the gangs carried on business as usual, guided by voices sealed behind steel doors. Pelican Bay had been designed to crush power. Instead, it had concentrated it. And the silence of the SHU masked a dangerous truth. The gangs had never been stronger, but there was something no gang could control: the human spirit. And in time, even the silence would be shattered. The hunger strikes. For years, inmates trapped in Pelican Bay's SHU lived in despair. Some were kept there for months. Others spent years, even decades, locked away in concrete tombs. There was no release date, no sentence to finish. Placement in the SHU could be indefinite, and often it was based on something as small as being accused of gang ties. Even without hard evidence, men lost their sanity. Families lost hope. But in 2011, something happened that no one saw coming. The silence was broken not with violence, but with resistance. It started with a few inmates refusing food. Then it spread. Within days, thousands of men across California prisons were participating in what became one of the largest hunger strikes in U.S. prison history. The demands were simple but powerful. End indefinite solitary confinement. Allow family visits. Stop labeling men as gang members without proof. The image was shocking. Cell blocks full of men lying on their bunks, refusing to eat. Guards walked past rows of prisoners who looked them dead in the eye and said nothing, silently starving themselves in protest. Days turned into weeks. Prison administrators were forced to take notice. Medical staff reported men collapsing, their bodies giving out. The hunger strike spread beyond Pelican Bay. Across the state, prisoners joined in solidarity. It was as if the most feared prison in California had suddenly lit a fire that burned through the entire system. And for the first time in decades, the outside world began to pay attention. Families of inmates held rallies. Human rights groups demanded investigations. News cameras turned their lenses north onto the fog and razor wire of Pelican Bay. Officials had to respond. Negotiations began. Some concessions were made. Solitary confinement rules were altered, policies re-examined. But the real victory wasn't just in the policy changes. It was in the fact that men who had been stripped of everything, contact, sound, freedom, had found a way to make their voices heard. Yet, victory was temporary. Though reforms came, the SHU did not vanish, and Pelican Bay still held its grip on every man locked inside. For some, survival became the only goal. For others, the dream of escape still flickered in the darkness. And when dreams of freedom clash with concrete walls, the system is tested in ways no one can predict. When the system cracks. From the very beginning, officials called Pelican Bay escape-proof. Its walls were concrete, its fences lined with razor wire, its towers always armed. But inside, even in the most secure prison in California, whispers of escape never died. Some attempts were crude, men trying to chip at concrete with makeshift tools, or tearing metal from vents. Others were far more sophisticated. In one case, guards intercepted a note smuggled out through an attorney. It hinted at a mass breakout, a plan that involved timing, weapons, and a coordinated strike. The prison locked down immediately. Cell by cell, guards tore through belongings, searching for evidence. They found nothing at first. But a week later, during a routine inspection, an officer stumbled on something hidden behind a toilet. A rope made of twisted bedsheets, knotted together carefully. It was proof that no matter how tight the walls were, the desire for freedom could never be locked away. Even guards felt the unease. If an escape ever succeeded, it wouldn't just be a prisoner slipping out. It would be some of the most dangerous men California had ever contained, men whose names carried fear across entire cities. The administration doubled down. Security tightened. Movements were reduced. But with every measure, tension inside grew worse. Inmates felt stripped of even the smallest scraps of humanity. Guards felt cornered, constantly waiting for the next riot, the next ambush, the next desperate attempt to break free. And so, Pelican Bay became something more than just a prison. It became a pressure cooker, one that boiled with violence, paranoia, and fear on both sides of the bars. The walls may have been unbreakable, but the people inside, guards and inmates alike, were beginning to crack. And as the years went on, the question no one wanted to ask lingered in the air. What happens when a prison designed to control fear becomes a place ruled by it? The walls that watch. Pelican Bay was built to control every second of an inmate's existence. But to many who lived and worked inside, the prison didn't just control, it consumed. From the moment a man entered, he could feel it. The weight of the place. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence, pressing down on everyone, gnawing at the mind. Guards felt it during the graveyard shift, when the fog rolled in thick around the towers, and the only movement was the beam of the searchlight slicing through the darkness. Inmates felt it inside the SHU, where the walls seemed to breathe with them, where the hum of fluorescent lights replaced the sound of the outside world. Every inch of Pelican Bay was designed for surveillance. Cameras stared down from every corner. Guards worked from armored glass booths, controlling doors remotely like puppet masters pulling strings. Movement was mechanical, timed, and tracked. Prisoners often said it felt like living inside a giant machine that never turned off, a machine that was always watching, always calculating. But what unnerved people most wasn't just the technology. It was the atmosphere. The prison sat on the edge of a dense redwood forest, surrounded by mist and coastal fog. The damp air seeped into the concrete, leaving cells perpetually cold. At night, the silence was so deep that men swore they could hear their own heartbeats echoing in their ears. Correctional officers, men and women trained to show no fear, admitted that patrolling the SHU at night was different from anywhere else. Some said it felt like walking through a tomb. Others described the silence as too loud, a quiet so sharp it buzzed in their heads. And then there were the inmates who didn't just fear the silence. They broke under it. Men started whispering to shadows, convinced someone was there. Others carved messages into the walls, not for anyone else to read, but just to leave proof they existed. A few became convinced the cameras were more than cameras, that the prison itself was alive, studying them, waiting for them to slip. One former guard told a story that stuck with him for years. He was walking past a row of SHU cells when an inmate suddenly stood at his door, staring straight at the camera above. The man never spoke, never blinked, just locked eyes with a lens and followed it, moving his head slightly each time the guard shifted. When the guard passed back minutes later, the inmate hadn't moved an inch. He was still staring, unblinking, as if locked in a staring contest with the machine itself. The guard admitted he quickened his pace. It was like he knew the camera was watching him. He said, "But he wanted me to know he was watching back." Psychologists warned that the conditions inside Pelican Bay could drive anyone to paranoia. Total isolation, endless surveillance, and the sense of being forgotten by the outside world created a mental loop men couldn't escape. Some inmates tried to fight back against the feeling of being buried alive. They screamed, banged on their doors, smeared paint or soap on their walls just to break the monotony. Others fell completely silent, withdrawing into themselves until they no longer spoke at all. Guards often feared those men the most. They weren't violent, they weren't loud, but there was something unsettling in the way they stared blankly through the slot in their doors, as if their minds had already left their bodies behind. The SHU wasn't just a cell block. It became something of a legend. Inmates arriving from other prisons spoke about it in hushed tones, calling it the end of the line. If you made a Pelican Bay's SHU, you had reached the bottom. There was no lower step, no further place to fall. And everyone knew what that meant. Men would do anything, say anything, even risk everything to avoid it. The fear of those walls became a weapon in itself. But the truth was darker. Even for those who never saw the inside of the SHU, Pelican Bay's reputation hung like a storm cloud over the entire California prison system. It was the ultimate punishment, the place you were sent when nothing else worked. And for the men already inside, it was proof that California was willing to do whatever it took to crush them, even if it meant crushing their humanity along with it. What most people don't realize is that Pelican Bay didn't just punish inmates. It left scars on the staff, too. Correctional officers worked long shifts in an environment where violence was always one heartbeat away, and where silence could be just as suffocating as screams. Some admitted they took the weight of Pelican Bay home with them. Nightmares, paranoia, even the feeling of being watched when they were off duty. One officer said it best, "You don't just work in Pelican Bay. Pelican Bay works in you." The prison had become more than concrete and steel. It was a presence, something almost alive, a machine of silence, fear, and control. And whether you were a prisoner locked in an SHU or a guard staring down at fog from a tower, you couldn't escape its gaze. The riot that shook Pelican Bay. The silence of Pelican Bay could be overwhelming, but silence doesn't always last. And when it broke violently. Riots inside Pelican Bay were not ordinary prison fights. They were orchestrated battles, planned with precision and carried out with a kind of ruthless efficiency that stunned even the most hardened guards. One of the most infamous riots erupted in the early years, when tensions between rival gangs exploded on the yard. The SHU may have kept leaders locked away, but their orders still slipped through the cracks. And on that day, those orders ignited chaos. It began without warning. Dozens of inmates suddenly turned on each other, weapons fashioned from sharpened metal hidden in their clothing. Within seconds, the yard turned into a battlefield. Guards watched in disbelief as men stabbed, slashed, and swarmed their rivals with terrifying coordination. It wasn't random violence. It was a statement, a reminder that the gangs still control the rhythm of life inside. Gun towers fired warning shots. Tear gas filled the air. Sirens wailed across the compound. But even as officers stormed the yard in riot gear, inmates refused to stop until their leaders' orders had been carried out. By the time the chaos ended, the ground was slick with blood, and bodies lay scattered across the concrete. What stunned officials most was how disciplined it all seemed. These weren't impulsive acts of rage. It was war directed from inside the SHU. Despite every camera, every locked door, every effort to crush communication, Pelican Bay's gangs had turned the most feared prison in California into their battlefield. After the riot, the prison went into full lockdown. Inmates were stripped, cells searched, everything examined. Guards uncovered coded notes, hidden weapons, and evidence of a communication system that never seemed to stop working. Officials realized that isolation alone couldn't kill the gang's influence. In fact, it might have made them stronger. For the men inside the SHU, riots were proof of their power. Even without stepping foot on the yard, they could make the ground shake. For the guards, it was a reminder that Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was a war zone, and they were outnumbered. And for the state, the riot became a symbol of a grim truth. The most secure prison in California could still bleed. But as bloody as the riots were, they were only one layer of Pelican Bay's darkness. The real horror wasn't always in the noise of battle. Sometimes it was in the silence of a single cell. The isolation experiment. Pelican Bay's SHU was supposed to be temporary confinement, but in reality, it became a warehouse for human minds. Some men stayed in isolation not for weeks, not for months, but for decades. The experiment was brutal. Cut men off from the world and see how long they lasted. Inmates had no clocks, no natural light, no human touch. Days bled into nights until time itself stopped having meaning. Guards reported that some men aged faster than they should have, their hair graying within years, their bodies weakening without sunlight. The psychological toll was devastating. Men began talking to themselves, holding entire conversations out loud. Others stopped speaking altogether, their voices disappearing from disuse. Some grew paranoid, convinced the guards were poisoning their food or watching them through invisible cameras. But the worst cases were those who lost their grip on reality entirely. One man carved messages into his skin with a piece of metal, believing it was the only way to send a letter. Another sat in the corner of his cell, rocking for hours, convinced someone else was living inside his body. For prison officials, these cases were statistics, evidence of the SHU's effectiveness at breaking men. For the inmates, it was torture without the word ever being spoken. Human rights organizations began calling Pelican Bay a psychological graveyard, a place where men were buried alive in concrete coffins. Yet even under those conditions, some prisoners adapted. They found ways to survive the silence. Through meditation, through writing letters, through sheer force of will. A few became stronger, more disciplined, determined not to let the SHU crush them. One inmate wrote later, "They can take my yard, my voice, my freedom, but they can't take my mind unless I give it to them." But the truth was unavoidable. Most men weren't that strong. For every prisoner who endured, many more fell into madness. And the SHU, with its endless silence, didn't care either way. The experiment was ongoing, day after day, year after year, and as the world outside began questioning the morality of such treatment, Pelican Bay continued, its walls swallowing men whole. Infamous inmates. Pelican Bay wasn't just another prison. It became the final destination for some of California's most infamous inmates. Gang leaders, cartel figures, lifers convicted of brutal crimes. Men whose names carried weight both inside and outside the walls. One of the most feared was a leader of the Aryan Brotherhood, locked in the SHU for decades. Even from his concrete box, he issued orders that reached across the state, directing violence and business from behind a steel door. Guards admitted that as long as he was alive, the gang would never truly be broken. On the other side of the racial divide, leaders of the Mexican Mafia and Waster Familia also called Pelican Bay home. These men weren't just prisoners. They were generals, their words capable of starting wars in California's neighborhoods. They lived steps away from each other, separated by walls but bound by the invisible networks they commanded. But not all infamous inmates were gang leaders. Some were men who became symbols of the SHU itself. One prisoner, locked away for over 30 years in solitary, was known by activists worldwide. His letters, smuggled out to journalists, described the experience of being buried alive in words so haunting they shook public opinion. Another inmate, once a rising figure in Los Angeles crime, described the SHU as a place where time dies. For guards, dealing with these figures was a balancing act. They had to show authority without provoking retaliation, enforce rules without giving ground. Every interaction carried risk, because a simple mistake could ripple outward, sparking violence across the prison system. For the state, housing infamous inmates at Pelican Bay was both a triumph and a curse. It kept the most dangerous men under lock and key, but also concentrated power in one place, making the SHU less a tomb and more a throne room for California's criminal empires. And for the men themselves, Pelican Bay was a stage. Even in silence, Their names carried weight, their influence stretching beyond the prison's foggy walls. They weren't forgotten. If anything, Pelican Bay kept their legend alive. The breaking point. Every system has limits, and Pelican Bay was no exception. The hunger strikes, the riots, the endless cycle of violence and silence, it all built pressure inside the walls. By the 2010s, the prison was facing intense scrutiny. Human rights groups accused California of cruel and unusual punishment. Courts began asking questions. Lawmakers couldn't ignore the stories any longer. Inside the SHU, inmates continued to resist in whatever ways they could. Some filed lawsuits, claiming decades of solitary confinement amounted to torture. Others kept refusing food, risking their lives to force change. Families of prisoners organized rallies outside, holding up photos of loved ones who hadn't seen the sun in years. The pressure worked. In 2015, a historic legal settlement was reached. California agreed to limit the use of indefinite solitary confinement, ending the practice that had defined Pelican Bay's SHU for decades. Thousands of men were slowly moved back into general population across the state. But the changes didn't erase the damage already done. Men who had spent 20 or 30 years in isolation were suddenly thrust back into environments full of noise, movement, and human contact. Some couldn't adjust. They flinched at every sound, avoided eye contact, or withdrew completely. Others lashed out violently, unable to handle the stimulation after years of silence. The breaking point had come, not just for the inmates, but for the system itself. Pelican Bay was forced to adapt, but its legacy of fear remained untouched. The SHU had changed California prisons forever, and even after reforms, its shadow stretched across the entire system. Living with the shadows. Even after reforms, Pelican Bay remained one of the most feared prisons in the country. Its reputation alone was enough to terrify inmates across California. The words Pelican Bay carried weight, a threat whispered in other prisons to keep men in line. For those who had lived inside, the shadows never left. Many described waking in the night years later, convinced they were still locked in a windowless box. Others struggled with paranoia, depression, and voices in their heads that began in the SHU and never stopped. Guards, too, carried scars. Some retired early, unable to shake the memories of endless silence and sudden bursts of violence. Others admitted that working at Pelican Bay changed the way they saw the world, making them distrustful, hardened, always on edge. The prison itself remained, its gray walls still rising out of the fog, its towers still lit through the night. To the outside world, it was a fortress of safety, a place where California's most dangerous men were locked away. But to those who knew its insides, Pelican Bay was more than that. It was a machine that ate people alive, grinding down inmates and staff alike until nothing remained but shadows. And yet, the prison story wasn't over. Because as long as men were locked inside, as long as silence filled those concrete cells, Pelican Bay would continue to haunt California. Its most feared prison, its darkest experiment, its lasting reminder that sometimes the walls meant to protect society end up destroying the very people inside them. Survival games. For many men, Pelican Bay wasn't just prison, it was survival. Life inside the SHU stripped everything away, leaving only the basics. Food trays for walls and the mind. To stay sane, inmates created routines, games, and strategies to fight the silence. Some worked out obsessively. Push-ups, sit-ups, pacing back and forth until sweat poured onto the concrete floor. A few claimed they built such discipline that when released from the SHU, they could run miles without breaking stride. Others turned to writing, crafting long letters to family, poetry scrawled on scraps of paper, or entire novels sent out one page at a time. Then there were the mental games. Some prisoners played chess in their heads, memorizing each move as if playing against invisible opponents. Others recited books they remembered from childhood, line by line, to keep their memory sharp. One man became so obsessed with his mental exercises that he learned multiple languages while locked inside. But survival wasn't just about keeping busy. It was about adapting to the rules of Pelican Bay. Respect meant everything. A look held too long at another inmate could mean death. A careless word whispered through a vent could bring retaliation. Even in silence, politics ruled. Alliances formed Messages spread, and the invisible lines between gangs dictated who lived in relative peace and who lived in constant danger. Guards, too, developed their own survival strategies. They worked in shifts that blurred together, always alert, always waiting for the next riot, the next attack, the next small slip that could spiral into chaos. For them, survival meant caution, routines, and sometimes shutting down their emotions completely. Pelican Bay was unforgiving. To make it out, inmates had to play their own survival games every single day. Some succeeded, others broke, and every story of survival carried its own scars, echoes of escape. No one was supposed to escape from Pelican Bay. It was built to be unbreakable, with concrete walls, steel doors, and towers that never stopped watching. But inside, men never stopped dreaming of freedom. Some escape attempts were almost laughable. Men trying to chip away at concrete with makeshift tools or prying at vents with broken spoons. Others were shockingly clever. A group of inmates once plotted to slip out hidden inside laundry carts, timing their movements with delivery trucks. The plan was foiled when guards discovered ropes and hooks hidden behind toilets. The most chilling part wasn't how close the attempts came to succeeding. It was the desperation behind them. Men were willing to risk everything, even death, for the chance to touch fresh air, to see open sky, to feel something other than concrete walls pressing in on them. For guards, each discovered plan sent waves of unease through the prison. If one man succeeded, others would follow. And if the escapees were gang leaders, the consequences could ripple across the state. Every security breach, no matter how small, meant lockdowns, searches, and fear. Escape wasn't just about running from the prison. For many, it was about running from the silence. Pelican Bay wasn't just a cage, it was a coffin. And for some, even the faintest chance of escape was worth the risk of never breathing again. The guard's burden. It's easy to think of Pelican Bay only in terms of inmates, but the guards carried their own battles. Every shift was a gamble. Would today bring silence, or would it bring a riot? Would an inmate launch an ambush with a hidden weapon? Or would the tension simply build, invisible but unbearable? Correctional officers were trained to stay detached, to see inmates as numbers rather than people. But in Pelican Bay, that line blurred. Watching a man waste away in silence for years had its effect. Some guards admitted they grew hardened, seeing suffering as routine. Others broke down, unable to bear the weight of it. There were whispers of corruption, too. With gangs holding so much power, some officers were accused of smuggling contraband, passing messages, or even collaborating with inmates. For others, the temptation wasn't money but influence. Being seen as a trusted ally inside meant protection in a place where trust was rare. The burden of Pelican Bay followed officers home. Some reported nightmares, sleepless nights, or paranoia. They watched the mirrors of their cars, suspicious of being followed. Their families lived with the tension too, never sure what stories would come to the door after a shift. Pelican Bay didn't just hold prisoners. It held its staff, binding them to its silence, its fear, its weight. For many, the hardest part wasn't surviving the shift. It was living with the memories afterward, the prison that still breathes. Pelican Bay was built to control chaos, to lock away the worst of the worst, to silence gangs, crush violence, and create order in a system that was spiraling out of control. And yet, what it became was something far different. It became a monument to fear, a machine of silence that swallowed men whole, a place where gangs still ruled, where riots shook the ground, where human beings disappeared into boxes so small that time itself seemed to vanish with them. The SHU turned men into shadows. It broke minds, scarred bodies, and created ghosts that still walk the yards of California's prisons today. Families lost fathers, brothers, and sons, not to death, but to silence so deep that they never truly came back. Guards carried their own scars too, living with the memories of a place that never stopped watching them, even after they left. Pelican Bay became more than a prison. It became a warning, a reminder that when fear rules, when silence is weaponized, when control matters more than humanity, the cost is greater than anyone can measure. And still, the prison stands, rising out of the fog on California's northern coast, its towers glowing through the night. For some, it's a fortress of safety. For others, It's a graveyard of the living. For all, it remains California's most feared prison. Because in the end, Pelican Bay isn't just walls and razor wire. It's a question about power, about fear, about what it means to lock a man away until the only thing he hears is the sound of his own mind. And that question still hangs in the air today. Did Pelican Bay protect society, or did it create a darkness that will never fade?